good evening, or perhaps it is morning for you. Either way, I invite you to set aside the clamor of the present and step quietly into the shadows of the past. Tonight, we will linger in the depths of the Middle Ages, in a season when survival itself was uncertain those long, brutal winters that pressed heavily upon every village, castle, and cloister. If you're new here, you're warmly invited to subscribe to our quiet corner of YouTube. And if you'd like, leave us a soft little comment below. Let us know where and when you're watching from. Perhaps you're listening late at night, or drifting off with the morning light. Imagine yourself in a place without central heating, without electric lights, without even glass windows to seal out the chill. A place where the sun rises late, hangs weak in the sky, and disappears early again, leaving you in darkness for most of the day. This is the medieval winter, a season not simply endured, but survived with grit, with ritual, and often with hunger gnawing at the belly. We will wander through 5 great themes tonight, tracing the rhythm of winter in medieval life. You will hear of homes smoky and dim, of larders scraped bare, of bodies layered in wool, but still trembling from cold. And yet, in between, there are flickers of resilience festivals to warm the spirit, songs against the silence, fires that gathered families close. Let us begin, then, with the world itself, with the cold, indifferent earth, the forest that stretched unbroken, the snow that fell thickly and stayed. This is where our story begins, in the sheer weight of the medieval climate, a force stronger than kings or armies. When we speak of medieval winters being brutal, we must first imagine the stage upon which daily life was set. Europe between roughly the 5th and 15th centuries was no uniform landscape. Its climate varied from the Mediterranean olive groves to the Nordic fjords. Yet for most of the continent, winter was not a gentle passing of cool air. It was a sustained assault of frost, wind, and snow. By the late Middle Ages, much of Europe had entered what historians call the Little Ice Age, a period of gradually cooling temperatures that lingered for centuries. Summers shortened, harvests failed more frequently, and winters stretched longer than the memory of elders could recall. Imagine an October where frost already stiffens the ground, and a May where snow might still fall across the fields. These were not merely inconvenient. They altered the rhythms of life and survival itself. Without modern forecasting, medieval people read the skies with deep anxiety. A ring around the moon, the way smoke drifted from a chimney, the early departure of migrating birds, all became omens of what kind of winter lay ahead. A harsh one might mean famine, for food was never stored in abundance. And famine in winter was particularly cruel, arriving when the body already struggled to keep warm. Picture the medieval countryside in December. The land is silent, except for the occasional creak of frozen branches or the distant bark of a hungry dog. Roads, such as they were, turn into frozen ruts or are buried beneath snow. Travel slows to a crawl. Traders vanish until spring. Most villages are cut off, left to their own meager resources. Inside those villages, the struggle against cold never ceased. There was no insulation beyond thatch and mud, no sealed windows to keep the draft out. A single fireplace might be the only source of heat, its flames too weak to warm an entire room, let alone a stone house. For most peasants, the walls were of wattle and daub-woven sticks covered with clay, and these cracked in winter, letting in icy air. Even castles, with their thick walls, were less cozy than they appear in fairy tales. Stone holds cold. The chill seeped into the bones of every inhabitant. The sun itself became a stranger. At northern latitudes, the daylight shrank to a few dim hours. Imagine a day that begins in darkness, briefly lightens to a gray gloom, and then folds itself back into night before the evening meal. Artificial light was scarce. Candles were expensive, and most peasants relied on rushlight's simple reeds dipped in tallow, which smoked and sputtered, giving little more than a weak glow. So darkness pressed in, hour after hour, as constant as the cold. Water froze solid. Wells were difficult to draw from. Rivers turned to ice, which sometimes allowed for crossing, but also cut off fishing and transport. Livestock struggled too. Animals had to be brought inside, into barns or even the same rooms as families, both for their warmth and their survival. The smell was pungent, but this mingling of human and beast was necessary. It was not merely temperature that made winters so punishing. It was the relentless length of them. From November through March, 5 months or more, the countryside slumbered in a death-like stillness. Grain lay dormant under frozen soil. Nothing grew in the gardens. Hunting was difficult, for animals burrowed deep or starved themselves. The human body, underfed and overexposed, weakened steadily. A cough in December might become a funeral in February. And still, life went on. Men trudged into forests for firewood, often returning with less than they needed. Women spun wool by dim light, hands chapped and raw. Children clustered near the hearth, their games muted by hunger and the absence of sun. The rhythm of life slowed almost to a halt, dictated not by clocks, but by cold. This was the setting of the medieval winter, an earth colder than we now know, homes unguarded against frost, food supplies limited, and the endless dark pressing at the edges of human existence. It was a test each year, repeated for generations, and it shaped the very fabric of medieval life. If the medieval winter was a relentless visitor, then the home was supposed to be its defense. But in truth, homes of the Middle Ages were less fortresses of warmth and more fragile shells against the cold. To understand the brutality of winter, one must step inside these dwellings and look at how people tried, and often failed, to keep the frost at bay. Imagine yourself entering a peasant's cottage in January. The door is low, often no taller than a man's chest, forcing you to stoop as you enter. This was partly practical. Smaller doorways helped keep precious heat from escaping. The floor beneath your feet is not wood or stone, but packed earth, hard and uneven. It grows damp in the winter, a chill rising from below like an unseen tide. The walls are woven hurdles of wood, plastered over with daub made from clay and straw. In summer they are adequate, but in winter they crack. Cold air slips easily through, and when the wind howls, it whistles audibly inside. At the center of this room, you would find the hearth, a modest fire pit rather than a grand fireplace. It is the heart of the home, not because it makes the space warm, it rarely succeeds at that, but because it is the only real source of light and heat. Families cluster tightly around it, the smoke rising toward a hole in the roof, or sometimes drifting sideways until it seeps through thatch. To modern sensibilities, the house would seem permanently smoky, eyes stinging, throats raw. Yet without this smoke, the family would freeze. For wealthier households, a chimney might exist, but these were innovations slow to spread. Many homes relied on the simplest vent, a gap where the thatch was thinner. In storms, snow or rain could slip through, hissing as it met the fire. To prevent this, families sometimes let their fires die out, choosing cold over smoke, but then they faced the arduous task of rekindling flame in the morning. Even stone buildings, those that we think of as solid and enduring, were not havens of warmth. Castles loomed as symbols of strength, yet their vast halls were notorious for their chill. A fire in the great hall might roar, but the heat rarely reached beyond a few steps from the flames. Courtiers wrapped themselves in cloaks, and tapestries were hung along the walls, not for decoration alone, but to block the seep of cold stone. At night, noble families retreated to chambers draped with heavy curtains, not around windows, but around beds. A bed was a kind of private microclimate, a small cocoon where bodies huddled beneath layers of wool and fur, hoping to trap enough warmth to see them through till dawn. The poor, of course, had no such luxury. A peasant's bed might be a simple sack stuffed with straw, shared by the whole family. In many homes, Animals were kept inside during the winter. Cows, goats, and even pigs might occupy one end of the room, their body heat serving as an additional source of warmth. The smell was overpowering, but this mingling of human and beast was practical. The warmth of livestock could be the difference between shivering through the night and surviving it. Firewood itself was a constant concern. Gathering it was hard labor, and forests were not always free for the taking. Much woodland was controlled by lords, and peasants were often forbidden to cut living trees. They scavenged fallen branches, uprooted stumps, or burned peat if it was available. Wood had to last the whole season, but the temptation to burn more in the darkest days was strong. By February, many families faced the winter's cruelest paradox. As the cold deepened, their stores of fuel dwindled. Inside the home, warmth was rarely shared equally. The space near the hearth was prime, and children often curled close to it, while older relatives resigned themselves to the shadows where the cold pressed harder. Even during meals, the family might eat quickly, eager to retreat beneath blankets or cloaks. Sleep came early, for the darkness was long, and there was little reason to stretch the day with weak candlelight. Those candles, when they existed, were precious. Made from tallow, they smoked and gave off an odor of animal fat. Beeswax candles were far superior, cleaner and brighter, but they were luxuries for the church and the wealthy. Most peasants relied on rushlights, reeds dipped in fat or grease, which sputtered, smoked, and burned down quickly. To spend hours awake by such light was wasteful. Better to crawl into bed and endure the night. Cold did not merely discomfort, it damaged. The dampness inside homes encouraged rot and illness. Walls grew mold, roofs dripped steadily. Feet never fully dried, leading to sores and infections. A child might wake to find their water jug frozen solid beside the bed. In castles, ice sometimes formed on the inner walls of chambers. Clothing hung indoors could freeze, stiff before the fire softened it again. And yet, medieval people adapted. Floors were sometimes strewn with rushes or straw, partly to soak up filth, but also to provide a thin insulation against the earth below. Beds were piled with whatever could be spared: old cloaks, pelts, woven blankets. Families slept in groups, conserving warmth by sharing body heat. In the absence of insulation, bodies themselves became the only reliable source of comfort. In monasteries, winters were endured with even greater austerity. Monks rose before dawn for prayers, their cells unheated, their cloisters open to the air. They walked on frozen flagstones, breath curling in the dim light of flickering lamps. Some regarded the cold as a form of discipline, a spiritual trial. But even in monasteries, fires burned in kitchens and refectories, for human flesh could not live by devotion alone. Thus, the medieval house, whether cottage or castle, hovel or hall, was less a defense against winter than a frail compromise with it. The walls did not keep the cold out so much as slow its entry. Fires did not banish the chill so much as make it briefly bearable. Winter lived inside with the people, its breath in every corner, its silence pressing against every roof. Survival meant enduring, not escaping. This was daily shelter in the Middle Ages, smoky, drafty, damp, and cold. Yet within these imperfect walls, life unfolded. Families told stories in the flickering light. Neighbors gathered when fuel could be shared. And in every home, the small, stubborn flame of survival burned against the long, dark season. In summer and autumn, the land was generous, at least in good years. Crops ripened, fruits hung heavy, and herds grew fat on grass. But the abundance of those months was deceptive. For winter brought silence to the fields and emptiness to the orchard. Nothing grew. Nothing ripened. And what you had set aside in autumn was all that would carry you to spring. The problem was simple: how to stretch limited stores of food across 5 long, bitter months. Preservation was not a choice, it was a necessity. Without refrigeration, without canning, without the modern comforts of frozen vegetables or tins in the pantry, medieval people relied on methods as old as civilization itself. Drying, salting, smoking, and storing underground became the fragile lifelines between harvest and hunger. Imagine the autumn bustle. In September and October, households raced to gather what the fields and gardens had produced. Grain was threshed and stored in sacks or bins, hidden as best as possible from rodents. Root vegetables, turnips, carrots, parsnips, and later potatoes were placed in pits or cellars, where the earth's cool dampness kept them from rotting too quickly. Apples were stored on straw, checked regularly for signs of decay, because one rotten apple could indeed spoil the rest. Salt was precious, for it turned fresh meat into something that could endure months of storage. Pork was especially valued. A single slaughtered pig might feed a family all winter, its flesh salted, smoked, or turned into sausages. Fat was rendered into lard, stored in pots, and used for cooking. Nothing was wasted. Ears, snouts, and trotters were boiled into stews, while intestines became casings for sausages. Even the blood was caught and cooked into puddings, a calorie-rich dish that did not last long, but was welcome in the lean weeks of December. Fish, too, was preserved especially in coastal regions or near rivers. It could be salted or dried, though the taste was far from fresh. Stockfish, stiff and leathery, was a staple in Northern Europe. For Catholics, whose religious calendar mandated many days of fasting from meat, fish became essential. Even in inland villages, salted herring might appear, traded along far-reaching routes from the sea. Grain, the backbone of medieval diets, was ground into flour, though it rarely resembled the fine, white flour of today. It was coarse, often mixed with husks or other grains, producing dark bread that was heavy and filling. In hard years, when grain stores ran low, bread was adulterated with acorns, chestnuts, or whatever else could be ground. This did little for taste, but it staved off hunger. Yet despite all these efforts, food supplies were fragile. A poor harvest meant disaster. Grain failed, and there was no surplus. Disease among livestock left fewer animals to slaughter. An early frost killed cabbages in the field. And so, famine was a frequent winter guest. Entire regions could suffer when weather, war, or plague disrupted the harvest. In a famine year, the diet became desperate. Families thinned their porridge, stretching a little grain with water. They gnawed on bark or boiled weeds when bread was gone. Some resorted to eating seed grain, the very kernels meant for planting in spring. It was a grim bargain, for it meant surviving today at the cost of hunger tomorrow. Even in better years, winter meals were monotonous. A pot of pottage simmered endlessly over the hearth. A stew of grains, beans, or vegetables, thickened day by day with whatever could be added. It was never exactly the same meal twice, but it was rarely exciting. In fact, some families ate variations of the same stew for weeks on end. Bread, dark and heavy, accompanied it when flour was available. Holidays provided brief relief. At Christmas, if fortune allowed, animals were slaughtered for feasts, and households dined on fresh meat before salting the rest. Ale was brewed from grain, though brewing was dangerous in winter, since yeast needed warmth. Still, special efforts were made. Festivals gave people not only food, but also hope, a reminder that winter would pass, that joy could be found even in scarcity. The body itself struggled with the diet. Malnutrition was common. In winter, fresh fruits and vegetables disappeared. Vitamin deficiencies left many weakened, though they had no words for such ailments. Scurvy, later famous among sailors, also afflicted those who endured long winters without greens. Children were particularly vulnerable. They grew thin, their bodies less able to withstand the cold. Illness struck more fiercely in the underfed. It is worth imagining how food scarcity shaped the rhythm of daily life. Today, most of us measure time by the clock. In the medieval winter, time was measured by the larder. How much grain remains? How many turnips are left in the pit? Will the salted pork last until Easter? Every day, the stores diminished, and every meal brought the question of how long they could be stretched. The wealthier classes fared better, but even they were not immune. Nobles dined on venison, capons, and imported spices, yet their kitchens also wrestled with preservation. A banquet might impress with roasted meats and rich sauces, but it came at the cost of exhausting precious stores. Even kings could not conjure strawberries in January. The rhythms of winter bent all people, rich and poor alike, beneath its rules. The contrast between autumn's abundance and winter's austerity was stark. In September, the granaries might seem full, the cellars stocked. By February, these same stores looked bare. Rats and damp claimed their share. Mold spread unseen. A family that seemed secure in November could face starvation by March. The phrase, "the hungry gap," was well known. The bleak weeks before spring crops appeared, when food was scarcest and hope thinnest. Still, resilience was part of the rhythm. People learned to endure the monotony of pottage, the toughness of dried fish, the saltiness of preserved pork. They learned to stretch small things, a handful of peas, a crust of bread, a spoon of lard, into something that might keep a household alive. And though hunger was constant, there was also a strange endurance, a quiet persistence that carried them year after year through the brutal winters. In these kitchens and cellars, you see the heart of winter survival. It was not warmth, for warmth was scarce. It was not light, for darkness ruled. It was food, preserved and eked out, that kept families alive. And always, it was never quite enough. If the medieval house was leaky and the food supply thin, then the body's last defense against the long cold was clothing. Fabric was armor against the wind, insulation against the stone floor, a fragile barrier between skin and frost. Yet medieval clothing, though ingenious in some respects, could never offer the warmth that we so easily summon today with padded jackets, fleece linings, and central heating waiting indoors. Wool was the foundation. Sheep dotted the medieval landscape, and their fleeces became the essential fabric of life. Wool could be spun thick or thin, woven loosely or tightly, and it had one quality that made it indispensable. It trapped heat, even when damp. A tunic of wool, belted at the waist, was a standard garment for men and women alike. In winter, it was layered one wool tunic over another, then perhaps a cloak draped on top. Cloaks were fastened with simple brooches or ties, and they could be pulled around the body like a portable blanket. Underneath, linen served as the base. Linen shirts and shifts were worn next to the skin, lighter than wool, but they absorbed sweat and provided a softer barrier against itchiness. For many, that single layer of linen might remain unchanged for weeks, washed rarely, if at all, during winter's freezing months. Hygiene was secondary to survival, and while lice, fleas, and the smell of unwashed fabric were constant companions, they were accepted as part of life. Head coverings were essential. Heat lost from the head was well understood, even if no one could explain it scientifically. Men wore coifs, simple caps tied beneath the chin, while women wrapped veils or wimples. Outdoors, hoods extended forward like a cowl, sometimes with a long tail of fabric that could be wound around the neck like a scarf. Children, too, were bundled as best as possible, though their garments were often hand-me-downs, patched and shortened until fabric wore thin. Gloves were rare for peasants, but mittens or simple wraps of cloth kept hands from freezing while gathering wood or tending animals. Feet, though, were perpetually vulnerable. Shoes were leather, sometimes lined with fur, but they soaked quickly and stiffened in frost. Many peasants stuffed straw into their shoes for insulation. Others wrapped feet in scraps of cloth, a practice that slowed frostbite but never prevented it. In villages where damp seeped into every corner, chilblains, painful sores caused by cold and wet, were common, especially among children. Fur was the luxury of the wealthy. Squirrel, rabbit, fox, and in the north, wolf or bear provided the warmest linings. Nobles draped themselves in fur-trimmed cloaks, sleeping in beds lined with pelts. These garments not only insulated, but also symbolized rank. To wear fur was to proclaim wealth, for the poor had little access to it. Peasants might scavenge a rabbit pelt here or there, but never enough to line a cloak. The contrast was stark. A lord walked into a feast wrapped in fox fur, while the serf outside wrapped himself in rough wool, patched for the 10th time. But even the finest fur could not conquer the dampness of medieval winters. Stone castles absorbed cold like sponges, radiating it back through every corridor. Bedchambers grew so cold that tapestries froze against the walls. A noble wrapped in fur might still shiver at night, their breath visible in the air. Thus, clothing was a defense, but never an escape. The body itself endured in ways we might find unimaginable. Today, we step from cold streets into heated rooms, but the medieval body knew no such relief. The chill was constant, seeping through shoes, biting at fingers, stiffening shoulders. Muscles worked against it every day, walking through snow, hauling firewood, carrying water from frozen wells. Sleep offered little respite, for the cold pressed through thin blankets and straw mattresses. And morning meant crawling into clothes that were still stiff and icy from the night before. Illness often followed. The cold weakened the body's defenses, and poor diets compounded the problem. Respiratory diseases flourished. Coughs became chronic. Tuberculosis, pneumonia, and influenza took their toll. Many simply lacked the reserves of fat or nutrition to fight them off. The poor, already malnourished, were hit hardest. Children were the most vulnerable. Wrapped in whatever scraps could be spared, they bore the cold less well than adults. Babies were swaddled tightly, their cradles placed as close to the hearth as smoke allowed. Still, infant mortality rose sharply in winter. The combination of cold, hunger, and disease created a gauntlet that many small bodies could not cross. Families often counted their children with a quiet realism, knowing that not all would survive until spring. And yet, resilience was written into every seam and fold. Clothes were patched endlessly, sleeves turned into mittens, cloaks restitched to fit growing bodies. A single wool garment might serve a family for decades, passed down, cut smaller, cut again, until it was rags. And even then, the rags might be twisted into wicks for rushlights, so that nothing was wasted. There was also ritual in clothing. To layer up was to prepare for the day's endurance. To wrap a cloak tight against the wind was to declare a small defiance. Winter will not have me today. In the evenings, the shedding of outer layers before bed became its own rhythm, a slow unwrapping of smoke-scented wool, the release of a body weary from chill. It is worth remembering, too, that clothing was not merely functional. Even in hardship, people sought beauty. Women embroidered hems, men decorated hoods, and fur trimmings were displayed proudly by those who could afford them. In festivals, brighter fabrics emerged from storage-dyed reds, blues, and greens, reminders of color in a season otherwise gray and white. These garments were treasured, often worn only for special occasions, but they provided warmth of another kind, the warmth of identity, of belonging, of spirit. Still, beneath the beauty, the truth remained. Medieval winters were not defeated by fabric. They were endured. Wool cloaks were damp with melting snow, mittens stiff with frost, shoes heavy with mud and ice. The body shivered beneath, pressing on, year after year, through seasons when warmth was never guaranteed. This, then, was the final layer of survival in winter, the clothing that wrapped the body, the resilience that wrapped the spirit, and the slow endurance of months when every breath clouded the air and every step carried the weight of cold. In the Middle Ages, most people lived from the land. Fields of grain, patches of vegetables, small herds of animals. These were not just sources of food, but the very rhythm of existence. The farming cycle was the heartbeat of the medieval year, dictating labor from sunrise to sunset, and shaping festivals, obligations, and even prayer. But in winter, that pulse slowed almost to stillness. Imagine the autumn harvest just completed. Men and women bent double in the fields, scythes cutting through grain, sickles hacking at stubborn stalks. The work was exhausting, yet urgent, for the harvest had to be brought in before the weather turned. Fields were stripped, the grain stored, the last hay gathered for livestock. Then suddenly, the land itself grew quiet. Frost stiffened the stubble, snow covered the furrows, and the plow was set aside. For months there was no soil to till, no seed to plant, no crop to weed. The fields waited, dormant, and so too did the peasants. At first glance, this might sound like a respite, a season of rest after months of back-breaking work. And in a way, it was. The frantic labor of summer and autumn gave way to slower days. But for peasants, rest was not leisure. Winter idleness brought its own kind of hardship. Without crops to tend, there was less work to provide food or income. Hunger gnawed louder, and time stretched long in the dim light. Some work remained, of course. Animals still needed feeding, and wood still needed gathering. Grain had to be milled, tools repaired, and houses maintained against the creeping cold. But these were tasks scattered across long, dark days, never enough to fill the hours fully. In this emptiness, families endured the strange rhythm of waiting for the soil to thaw, for the sun to rise higher, for life to quicken again. It is worth pausing to think of how unusual this pattern is to us today. In the modern world, work rarely ceases with the seasons. Offices stay lit year-round. Shops open their doors regardless of frost. But in the Middle Ages, winter imposed a true pause. The farmer's most important tool, the plow, stood useless in the frozen ground. The peasant's greatest wealth, the seed, was sealed away until spring. To fight the season was futile. The earth would not yield. This enforced idleness bred both hardship and opportunity. On the one hand, families lived with constant anxiety. Would the stored food last? Would the animals survive? Would illness claim the weak? On the other hand, the quieter days allowed for other kinds of labor. Men carved wood into handles or bowls. Women spun wool into thread, mended clothes, and prepared fabric for weaving. Children helped as they could, twisting fibers, feeding chickens, carrying water. Work shifted from the fields to the hearth, from soil to hand. And yet, even these tasks could not fill the whole season. The dark hours were long, and the days short. In northern regions, daylight might last no more than 6 hours. Much of life was lived by firelight in smoke-filled rooms. Time stretched slowly, measured less by clocks than by the dwindling pile of firewood, the shrinking sack of grain. This slow pace had a psychological weight. For a people used to constant labor in the fields, winter idleness was unsettling. Too much time invited worry. The mind turned to fears, of famine, of raids, of disease. In such long hours, stories were told, songs sung, prayers repeated. Oral traditions thrived in these months. For words were the one resource that did not run out. But even stories could not always banish the gnawing sense of waiting. Work rhythms also varied depending on class. For the peasant tied to the soil, idleness often meant hardship. For the lord of the manor, it meant a season of administration. Accounts were tallied, rents recorded, disputes judged. The manor court, held in winter, dealt with debts and obligations. In that sense, the cold months were a time of reckoning, when peasants might be reminded of rents owed and lords reaffirmed their control. Monasteries, too, filled their winters differently. Monks, bound to strict routines, prayed, studied, and copied manuscripts. The cold slowed their fingers, but the discipline of their order gave shape to otherwise empty days. Scribes bent over parchment, breath visible in the chill, ink freezing in the well. For them, winter was not idle, it was another form of endurance, spiritual as well as physical. One might think of festivals, too. The calendar of the church punctuated winter with moments of ritual. Advent, Christmas, Epiphany, these broke the monotony. Fasting periods alternated with feasting days. Villagers gathered, if only briefly, to mark time and reassure themselves that life had rhythm, even when the fields lay dead. Yet between these feasts, the quiet returned, heavy and long. The rhythm of the farming cycle, thus shaped more than labor it, shaped survival itself. A good harvest in autumn meant a less anxious winter. A poor one meant dread, idleness filled not with craftwork and storytelling, but with the thin patience of hunger. And all waited for spring. Spring, when plows returned to the earth, when seeds once again touched soil, when hands and backs bent to labor with relief rather than despair. The medieval winter was brutal, not only for its cold, but for its silence. Fields slept, tools rusted, and time itself seemed to stretch like an endless night. For those who lived by the land, this was not rest. It was endurance, a waiting game played every year, with survival as the only prize. When the soil froze and the fields fell silent, medieval people turned inward. The rhythm of life shifted from plowing and harvesting to tasks that could be done by hand. In the dim light of hearth fires, within the smoky shell of the house. These were the crafts and indoor trades, the small labors that stitched the fabric of winter together. They were not as urgent as gathering the harvest, nor as grand as summer construction, but they filled the long, slow days of the cold months, and without them, life would have unraveled. Wool spinning was perhaps the most common of these winter tasks. The sheep had been shorn in summer, and by winter the fleece had been washed, combed, and carded into soft bundles of fiber. Now, in January, women and children sat close to the hearth, distaffs in hand, drawing fibers into thread with a practiced rhythm. The sound of the spindle whirring was as familiar as birdsong in spring. Thread spun in winter would be woven into cloth when the days grew longer, eventually becoming garments or blankets that might keep the next winter at bay. It was work that required patience, not speed. In the faint glow of rushlights, fingers moved steadily, twisting and pulling, producing something small but essential. Children learned by watching, then by trying, their first crooked threads joining the growing skein. Men, too, might spin if necessity demanded, though it was more often the work of women, passed down from mother to daughter, generation to generation. Weaving itself was often left to warmer months, but some weaving did continue in winter, especially in larger households. Looms were heavy and took up space, but when possible, they were set up in corners of halls or workshops. The rhythmic thump of the loom was another winter sound. Steady, repetitive, almost like a heartbeat inside the stillness. Cloth was life. It was warmth, shelter, identity. Without the spinners and weavers of winter, the coming year would have been naked indeed. Woodworking also filled the season. Farmers who could not plow could carve. Broken tool handles were replaced, new plows shaped, carts mended. A peasant might carve spoons or bowls for household use, while more skilled craftsmen fashioned chests, benches, or wheels. The smell of freshly cut wood mingled with the smoke of the fire, a reminder that even in the cold, hands could create. Ironworking was slower in winter. Forges needed fuel, and charcoal was expensive. Still, village smiths mended tools when required. A hoe broken in summer might wait until winter to be reforged, when the fields demanded less labor. Sparks flew in the dim light of short afternoons, a brief brightness against the gray. For those in towns, trades kept their rhythm regardless of season. Bakers still baked, though bread was scarcer. Butchers worked when animals were slaughtered, especially around Christmas. Tanners cured hides, though the cold made the process slower. In larger towns, winter was a time for merchants to tally accounts, repair stalls, and prepare for spring markets. Indoor trades thrived where food was more secure. In peasant homes, one constant winter task was repair. Clothes were patched, cloaks stitched, shoes mended. Threadbare garments were turned, seams reinforced, holes roughly covered. A child's tunic might be lengthened with scraps. Cloaks were darned until they were more patch than fabric. It was not wasteful, it was survival. Every stitch stretched the life of a garment further, each patch a small defiance against the cold's steady assault. Animal care was also a winter occupation. Livestock, huddled in barns or sometimes sharing the living space, needed feeding and mucking out. Hay was rationed carefully, and animals were led outside only when weather allowed. Sheep, in particular, needed tending, for they were wealth on 4 legs. The wool of next summer depended on their survival now. Some crafts were tied to religion. Candle making, though done at various times of year, was particularly valuable in winter. Rushes were peeled and dipped in tallow, creating the weak but necessary lights that pushed back the endless nights. In monasteries, beeswax candles were prepared, burning cleanly on altars, even as the cold froze ink in the scriptorium. There were also communal labors. Villagers might gather to thresh remaining grain, flails striking rhythmically on barn floors, beating kernels free from their husks. This work echoed like muffled drums through the stillness of the countryside. Flax fibers, retted earlier in the year, might be processed now, pulled and combed into strands that could be spun. Even leisure took on the shape of craft songs were sung to accompany spinning or threshing, stories told while hands worked steadily in the half-light. Children were not idle either. They fetched water from wells, even when the ropes stiffened with ice. They gathered kindling, small sticks to coax flames in the hearth. They helped twist fibers, plucked feathers for bedding, or watched livestock while parents worked. Childhood was not spared the labor of winter. It was simply folded into it. These indoor trades did not provide abundance. They did not add food to the larder or heat to the room, but they maintained life. They repaired what had worn, created what would be needed, and passed the time in small, steady acts of making. In a season defined by waiting, they offered at least the comfort of progress, a skein of wool spun, a tool mended, a cloak patched. It is easy, perhaps, to imagine these tasks as quaint spinning beside the fire, carving wood by hand. But in truth, they were survival disguised as routine. To fail in them was to face next winter without clothing, without tools, without the simplest necessities. Each act of craftwork was a thread in the fragile fabric of survival, woven tighter against the cold. Thus, winter was not entirely idle. The fields slept, yes, but the hands remained busy. In cottages, in barns, in workshops, the rhythm of craft and repair filled the empty hours, giving shape to days that might otherwise have been consumed by hunger and silence. And though the cold pressed in, though darkness lingered, these small acts of making whispered stubbornly, "Life goes on." If the medieval winter pressed itself against every wall and into every body, it did not do so equally. Cold is universal, but comfort is not. In the long months between November and March, the experience of winter for a peasant in a mud and thatch cottage bore little resemblance to that of a noble huddled in a castle chamber lined with fur. Yet, for all their wealth and privilege, even the powerful were not free from winter's hand. What differs is how they endured it, and what resources they commanded in the fight against cold and hunger. Imagine first the peasant. His house is modest, one room if fortune is kind, with walls of wattle and daub, and a roof of thatch that leaks snowmelt when the wind turns. The floor is damp earth, the air filled with smoke from a hearth too small to truly warm the room. His cloak is patched wool, his shoes stuffed with straw, his belly not quite full. By midwinter, the salted pork is thinning, the root cellar is half empty, and the family looks anxiously at the dwindling sack of grain. His days are spent rationing, repairing, and waiting, all while hunger presses closer. Now shift to the noble household. The castle walls are thick stone, draped with tapestries to cut the draught. The fire in the great hall blazes with cartloads of wood, servants hauling logs without cease. Tables are laden at feasts with venison from the forests, birds from the mews, bread from the ovens, and wine from distant vineyards. The lord wraps himself in fox fur, his lady in ermine. At night they retire to chambers where the bed is curtained, feather mattresses piled high, servants standing by with warming pans filled with coals to heat the sheets. By comparison to the peasant, the noble is ensconced in luxury. And yet luxury did not abolish winter. The castle's stones, no matter how thick, radiated cold. The great hall fire warmed only those seated close to it. Further back, courtiers shivered. The draughts slipped under doors, whistled through arrow slits, crept into bedchambers. Even fur-lined cloaks could not make icy air gentle. Water froze in jugs inside the chambers of kings, just as it did in peasant cottages. For all the wealth at their command, nobles still breathed frost in their sleep. Food, too, was subject to the season. A noble's larder was larger, and their supplies were greater, but they too relied on salted meats, stored grain, and preserved fish. They had more variety, more spices to disguise the taste, more wine and ale to wash it down. But fresh fruit and vegetables were as scarce in castles as in cottages. Strawberries and cherries were memories of summer, not realities in January. Even queens dined on root vegetables and salted pork when winter stretched long. The key difference was abundance. Where the peasant scraped the last of the grain from the bin, the noble had reserves. Where the peasant salted one pig, a noble salted dozens. Where the peasant patched his cloak until it was more whole than fabric, the noble commissioned new garments, trimmed with fur, brightly dyed, heavy and warm. Survival for the poor was a question. For the rich, it was an inconvenience. But even the noble's comfort rested upon the labor of peasants. It was the villagers who sowed and harvested the grain, who tended the pigs, who gathered the wood that blazed in castle hearths. Winter survival for the nobility was built upon the backbreaking work of those who suffered most. When famine struck, peasants went hungry first, so that tithes and rents might still be paid. Lords and monasteries often had full granaries when villages starved, the flow of food directed upward. This inequality was not invisible. Peasants knew that their hunger was not shared, that feasts echoed through castle halls while their own bowls were thin. Yet revolt was dangerous, and most endured, turning to community and custom for comfort. They gathered for festivals, shared what little they had, and told stories by the fire to push back despair. Nobles, by contrast, occupied their winters with hunting, feasting, and sport luxuries peasants could scarcely imagine. The divide extended beyond food and clothing. Entertainment itself showed the difference. A peasant's leisure in winter was telling tales, singing songs, or carving wood by the fire. A noble's leisure was jousts in warmer months, but also winter banquets, dances, and elaborate rituals. Music filled their halls. Jesters performed, poets recited, chessboards were set out. Winter, for the nobility, became a season of refinement and display, where the absence of fieldwork gave more time for courtly pursuits. Yet there were moments when the gap narrowed. Disease, for instance, did not discriminate as cleanly as hunger. Colds, fevers, and plagues crept into castles as easily as they did into cottages. A noble wrapped in ermine was not immune to pneumonia. An underfed servant could carry illness into the lord's own chamber. Winter's chill equalized health in ways that status could not entirely resist. And there were symbolic burdens, too. Nobles bore the pressure of providing. A lord who let his peasants starve risked revolt, however unlikely. A noble family that squandered its stores faced shame, even ruin. Winter could expose weakness in power as much as in health. A lord who failed to keep his hall warm, or his table full, lost more than comfort. He lost authority. Still, for the ordinary villager, winter was a season of survival. For the noble, it was a season of endurance, softened by wealth, but still colored by hardship. Both shivered, both hungered, but one did so in silence and poverty, the other in luxury and ceremony. This divide, stark and undeniable, shaped not just the experience of winter, but the very structure of medieval society. The resilience of peasants kept lords alive. The wealth of lords determined the suffering of peasants. And winter, indifferent and unyielding, pressed on them both, reminding each year that cold and hunger cared little for titles. Though medieval winters were long and harsh, they were not devoid of brightness. Amidst hunger, cold, and waiting, people turned to ritual and festivity to punctuate the darkness. These were moments when music replaced silence, when food, however scarce, was shared more freely, when communities came together to remind themselves that the season would not last forever. Festivals were more than entertainment. They were survival for the spirit. The most central of these was, of course, Christmas. The medieval calendar revolved around the liturgical year, and in the bleakest weeks of December, Christ's nativity offered cause for celebration. Christmas was not a single day, but a season, stretching from December 25th through Epiphany in early January. For peasants, this meant a rare break from toil, sanctioned by church and lord alike. For nobles, it meant lavish feasts, ceremonies, and displays of generosity. Picture the peasant village at Christmas. Though the cellar is thin, families pool what they can. A pig might be slaughtered for the holiday, its meat divided among households. Ale is brewed, if any grain can be spared. Evergreen branches are brought into cottages, their scent fresh against the smoke. Songs are sung, some religious, some older and rooted in folk traditions that predate Christianity. The church bells ring, summoning villagers into the chill night to hear Mass, their voices rising in hymns that echo through stone naves. For a moment, hunger is forgotten, and cold is borne more easily. In the Lord's Hall, the contrast is sharp. Banquets stretch long, tables laden with roasted meats, pies, stews, and spiced wine. Minstrels play, jesters jest, and guests dine until their bellies ache. But even here, Christmas carried a symbolic weight beyond indulgence. Lords were expected to show generosity, to feed the poor, to distribute alms, to remind all that Christian charity flowed from high to low. For a few days, at least in appearance, the bonds of obligation softened. Twelfth Night, marking the end of the Christmas season, brought its own traditions. Role reversals were common in some regions. A peasant might be crowned king of the revels. Servants might play tricks on masters, and misrule reigned for a brief time. It was laughter in the face of hardship, a temporary inversion of the order that otherwise governed every day of the year. Beyond Christmas lay other winter festivities. Candlemas in February, marking the midpoint of winter, was one. Candles were blessed in churches, their flames a promise that light would return, that the darkness was not endless. Villagers carried these candles home, their faint glow symbolic of renewal. The days were still short, the nights still bitter, but hope flickered more brightly. Perhaps the liveliest celebration was Carnival, just before Lent. By late winter, food stores were at their lowest, but Carnival called for feasting nonetheless. Meat, eggs, and dairy were consumed in abundance, partly because the church's fasting season forbade them, and partly because they would spoil if kept longer. Carnival was a last indulgence before austerity, a riot of color and noise in an otherwise gray landscape. Masks, costumes, and processions filled the streets and towns, while villages echoed with laughter, dancing, and song. Even hunger was set aside for a night, replaced with merriment that defied winter's gloom. These festivals mattered because they punctuated monotony. For months, life was measured by dwindling food and fading firewood. Festivals restored rhythm, offering moments of intensity in the long, flat line of winter days. They reminded people that joy was still possible, that community still existed, that survival was not just physical but emotional. Even smaller rituals carried weight. Wassailing, for example, brought villagers together to sing and drink to the health of orchards, blessing them for the coming year. In some places, mummers performed plays, their crude humor breaking through the stillness. Songs were passed down, not just as entertainment, but as living traditions that tied generations together. The church calendar ensured that winter was filled with observances, both solemn and joyful. Advent, Christmas, Epiphany, Candlemas, Carnival, and then Lent. They created a cycle within the season, offering structure to days otherwise blurred by darkness. These observances gave meaning to waiting. To wait for Christmas was to wait with anticipation, not just dread. To wait for Lent was to wait with purpose, not just hunger. And though the noble and peasant experienced these festivities differently, they shared them. Both gathered in churches, both heard the same Mass, both celebrated the same holy days. Wealth shaped the feast, but faith bound all. Even when hunger gnawed, the act of coming together, of singing familiar hymns, of marking sacred time, gave strength. It is easy, in the comfort of modern heating and endless food supply, to overlook the importance of these winter festivals. Today, they are holidays, pleasant but not necessary. In the Middle Ages, they were lifelines. They broke despair, lifted spirits, and reminded people that spring would come. They were, in their way, as vital as firewood or salted pork. So, while the medieval winter was brutal, it was not silent. It rang with bells, echoed with song, flickered with candles, and burst into laughter at carnival. For brief moments, cold and hunger were pushed aside, and life was celebrated in defiance of the season. These were not luxuries. They were survival for the heart, if not the stomach. If hunger was winter's constant companion, then illness was its shadow. The cold months were not simply uncomfortable. They were dangerous. In houses without insulation, with bodies weakened by poor diet and spirits dimmed by long darkness, disease found easy purchase. A cough that began as nothing more than a tickle in the throat might, in January's chill, end in a funeral procession across frozen ground. The medieval body, already vulnerable by modern standards, entered winter at a disadvantage. By November, diets narrowed to bread, pottage, salted meat, and little else. Fresh vegetables vanished. Fruit, unless carefully stored, was gone. Milk grew scarce as animals gave less in the cold months. Nutrients dwindled, and with them, the body's strength. The immune system was not a concept medieval people could name, but they understood the feeling of weakness, of fatigue that lingered, of sickness that spread more easily when bellies were not full. The cold itself was an enemy. In drafty cottages, with smoke-filled air and damp earth underfoot, people shivered day and night. Cold, wet lungs were fertile ground for disease. Respiratory illnesses flourished. Coughs and fevers spread through villages, carried from hearth to hearth. What we now call pneumonia or influenza cut down children, the elderly, and the already weak. Medieval people lacked the words to distinguish one illness from another. They spoke of fevers, of consumption, of the winter sickness. But whatever the name, the effect was the same. High mortality, especially in February and March, when food stores were low and cold deepest. In towns, the situation worsened. Crowded houses, narrow streets, smoke, and filth created breeding grounds for contagion. Fires smoldered indoors, filling lungs with soot. Animals lived alongside people. Water sources froze, forcing families to use stagnant supplies that carried disease. In these conditions, coughs became chronic and outbreaks spread quickly. A single infection could sweep through entire quarters in a matter of weeks. One of the most dreaded winter companions was tuberculosis, though they did not know it by that name. They called it consumption, for it seemed to consume the body slowly. A cough that never ended, the blood in the handkerchief, the thinness that worsened no matter how much food one tried to eat. These were familiar signs. Winter only sharpened its teeth. The damp, the smoke, the malnutrition all gave it fertile ground. And then there was plague. Not every winter brought it, but when it came, cold months offered little resistance. The Black Death itself arrived in Europe in 1347 and returned in waves for centuries. Though the height of outbreaks was often tied to warmer months when fleas thrived, winter did not bring safety. A house sealed against cold was also sealed against fresh air. Quarantines were harsh, and the sick were often left to perish in their homes, their neighbors too frightened to enter. Even in years without plague, lesser fevers swept through populations. Measles, smallpox, and influenza struck hardest when families were confined indoors, breathing the same air. A single sick child could infect an entire household. Mortality spikes in winter were not accidents. They were part of the season's rhythm. Chroniclers noted it. Deaths rose in January, peaked in February, and sometimes eased only when spring's air returned. Monasteries, though more ordered, were not immune. The strict discipline of cloistered life meant shared dormitories, shared meals, and long hours of prayer in cold chapels. Coughs echoed through stone halls, and illness carried silently from monk to monk. Yet monasteries also preserved knowledge of remedies, herbal concoctions, warm broths, bloodletting. These offered comfort, but little cure. A fever might be met with sage tea, garlic, or honey. Sometimes the body healed. Often it did not. For ordinary villagers, remedies were simple and born of necessity. A warm compress, a broth brewed from onions, a prayer whispered over the sickbed. They bundled the fevered in blankets, fed them hot ale, and hoped. But herbs did not stop pneumonia. They did not cure consumption. They soothed, but they rarely saved. Death, when it came, was accepted with weary resignation, as much a part of winter as snow on the fields. Children bore the brunt. Their smaller bodies had fewer reserves to withstand cold and hunger. An infant born in late autumn faced a perilous first season. The mother's milk might fail if her own diet faltered. Smoke irritated tender lungs. A simple cough could end a short life. Many parents entered winter, knowing not all their children would greet spring. The grief was deep, but dulled by repetition, by the inevitability of loss. Winter taught families to measure love in days and weeks, not decades. Even those who survived winter's illnesses often carried their marks. Chronic coughs lingered for life. Scars from smallpox remained. Malnutrition stunted growth, leaving children smaller, weaker, less able to withstand the next winter. It was a cycle that repeated itself each year, wearing down communities over generations. And yet, resilience was remarkable. Communities endured. They mourned, they buried, and then they continued. The sick were tended as best as possible. Priests anointed the dying. Families sat close to the hearth, not only for warmth, but for companionship in illness. Death was a part of life, and though it came more often in winter, it was met not with surprise, but with acceptance. The medieval winter, then, was not only cold, but contagious. It was a season when the body weakened, when fevers multiplied, when coughs echoed in dark rooms. Survival meant not just enduring the frost, but navigating a season when the invisible enemy of disease stalked every home. And in this, perhaps more than in hunger or cold, we glimpsed the true brutality of medieval winters. The chill might be endured, food might be stretched, but illness struck without warning, and no fire, no feast, no cloak could fully protect against it. If disease was winter's shadow, Then famine was its heavy hand. Not every winter brought it, but when it did, the season became more than uncomfortable. It became deadly. Medieval Europe lived close to the edge of scarcity. A poor harvest in autumn, a summer of storms, an early frost, a war cutting supply lines, all could send ripples into winter that deepened into famine. The medieval peasant had no cushion of abundance. Grain stores were calculated with care, livestock rationed with precision, gardens emptied methodically. When the harvest was poor, the gap between need and supply stretched wide. Winter, already a time of hunger, became a season of desperation. Imagine a village after a failed harvest. In October, the granaries are already thin. The root cellar is not full. Pigs and sheep have been slaughtered early, leaving less meat salted for the months ahead. By December, the first signs of shortage show. The loaves grow smaller. Pottage is watered down. Meals are fewer, stretched further. By January, the anxiety deepens. Mothers count turnips with their eyes. Children lick bowls clean of broth, as if the taste might fill them. By February, the cupboards are bare. What remains is meager. A handful of grain, a few dried beans, perhaps a crust hardened beyond chewing. Famine was not merely hunger. It was the slow erosion of strength. The body, deprived of calories, became less able to fight disease. Wounds healed slowly. Coughs lingered. Cold was felt more deeply. A man who might carry firewood in November collapsed under the same load in February. Children stopped playing. They curled near the fire, listless, conserving energy. The elderly thinned to frailty, their bodies surrendering first to hunger's demand. There are records, chilling in their understatement, of famine years when mortality soared. The Great Famine of 1315 to 1317 is perhaps the most notorious. A series of cold, wet summers ruined crops across northern Europe. Livestock died in droves. Grain rotted in the fields. Winter after winter, food ran out. Chroniclers describe people eating dogs, cats, even the bark of trees. Others wrote of seeds meant for spring being consumed, leaving no hope for future harvests. The famine killed millions, perhaps 10 to 15% of Europe's population. But not every famine was so grand. Smaller famines haunted local villages regularly. A harsh frost could destroy crops in a single valley. A flood could ruin a region's harvest. War made matters worse. Armies marching through fields trampled grain, stole livestock, seized food for their soldiers. In those years, famine followed swiftly behind. Mortality spikes followed predictable patterns. Infants and children died first, their bodies too small to withstand long hunger. The elderly followed, their strength too diminished to endure. Working adults clung on longest, but even they succumbed if famine stretched long. Villages kept careful counts, not out of science, but out of necessity. How many mouths could still be fed? How many hands were still strong enough to work when spring came? Hunger also altered behavior. Desperation drove theft. A villager might sneak into a lord's storehouse, risking harsh punishment, even death, for a sack of grain. Families abandoned their homes, seeking food in neighboring regions. Some turned to begging at monastery gates. Their dignity surrendered in exchange for a ladle of broth. Monks recorded the endless line of the hungry, gaunt faces pressed at cloister doors. Communities strained under famine. Neighbors who once shared might turn inward, protecting their own dwindling stores. The bonds of generosity frayed. Yet paradoxically, famine also fostered communal endurance. In some villages, families pooled food, ensuring that all survived a little longer. In others, lords released grain at reduced prices or distributed alms, partly out of charity, partly to prevent revolt. Survival was collective as much as individual. The psychological toll of famine was heavy. Hunger gnawed not only at the stomach, but at the mind. Time slowed, measured only by emptiness. Each day was endured, not lived. Mothers listened to children cry with nothing to give them. Fathers stared at empty barns, their work undone by weather. Hope withered alongside strength. Chroniclers describe villages silent, but for the cough of the sick and the groan of the hungry. Even when famine lifted, its scars remained. Survivors carried weakness into spring. Malnourished children grew stunted. Adults, weakened by long hunger, succumbed more easily to the next illness. Communities shrank. Fields went untilled for lack of hands. Villages sometimes disappeared altogether. Hunger was not just a season, it was a force that reshaped the landscape of human life. And yet, famine was part of the rhythm medieval people accepted. They feared it, prayed against it, and mourned when it came. But they knew it as a possibility written into every harvest. In prayers, in rituals, in church processions, they begged for good weather, fertile fields, and generous harvests. Every loaf of bread in summer carried the memory of hunger in winter. It is easy, from our vantage, to see famine as an exception, a disaster. For them, it was a familiar guest, dreaded but known. Mortality spikes were expected, part of the cycle of life. In years of plenty, relief was cautious, joy tempered by memory. In years of want, survival was measured in mouthfuls. So famine, intertwined with winter, was not simply the absence of food. It was the presence of fear, of weakness, of death measured in waves across generations. It was a reminder, each year, that human life hung by a thread, stretched thin between harvest and hunger. And when the thread snapped, winter claimed its due. Winter did not only gnaw at the body, it pressed also upon the mind. To live through a medieval winter was to endure a long confinement, a slow unfolding of days when light was scarce, work limited, and the world shrank to the size of a single village, or more often, a single smoky room. Hunger and cold may have been visible burdens, but it was the endless dark, the stillness, that seeped quietly into thought and spirit. Consider the simple rhythm of daylight. In summer, peasants rose with the sun, worked until evening, and filled the long hours with motion. In winter, daylight might last no more than 6 or 7 hours. In northern regions, less. The sun appeared late, weak and low, then vanished almost as soon as it arrived. To live in such darkness, year after year, was to surrender to a rhythm of stillness. For peasants, the short days meant fewer hours of labor outside and longer hours indoors, pressed close to fire and family. For nobles, it meant endless nights in drafty halls, conversations dragging long after the feast was done, the only entertainment firelight and stories. Confinement within the home was both protection and prison. In cottages, space was tight, often one room for an entire family. Men, women, children, and sometimes livestock crowded together. Privacy was almost non-existent. The same faces stared back day after day. The same voices filled the air. Arguments flared easily. Small irritations smoke in the eyes, crying children, dripping roofs grew large when there was no escape. The dark pressed not only from outside, but within the walls. The human spirit, like the body, weakens under such strain. Modern psychology speaks of melancholy, of seasonal depression. Medieval people had no such terms, but they knew the heaviness. They spoke of gloom, of idleness, of the noonday demon, a phrase monks used for the oppressive boredom and despair that crept into the soul when days blurred together. Long winter hours gave space for worry to fester. Would the grain last? Would illness claim the children? Would spring come at all? The questions circled endlessly, and in the stillness of the night, they grew louder. Monks recorded this battle with the mind more clearly than most. In their cloisters, silence and routine were meant to discipline thought, but in winter, the monotony weighed heavily. They described acedia, a spiritual fatigue, when prayer felt empty and the hours stretched unbearably. To sit in a cold stone cell, ink freezing in the well, body aching from the chill, and try to focus on sacred words, it tested not only faith but sanity. A monk might nod into sleep or drift into doubt, his mind clouded as much as his breath in the cold air. For villagers, the psychological toll took other forms. Children grew restless, confined indoors, unable to play in fields buried in snow. Parents carried the strain of feeding them with little food. Families coped with boredom through stories, songs, and small games, but even joy can grow stale when repeated too often. Sometimes tempers snapped. Winter was a season when disputes within families or neighbors grew sharp, sparked by the simple weariness of waiting. The silence itself carried weight. Without the constant activity of summer fields, villages fell quieter. The buzz of insects, the clatter of tools, the shouts across fields, all were replaced by muffled stillness, broken only by the creak of ice or the cough of the sick. Such silence could feel heavy, even ominous. To wake in the night, hear only the wind outside and the breathing of family within, was to feel profoundly small against the vast dark. It is little wonder, then, that rituals and stories thrived in winter. Folklore filled the void left by silence. Tales of spirits, witches, and wandering souls were told by firelight. They gave shape to fears otherwise formless. If you felt unease in the dark, perhaps it was the wild hunt riding through the skies, or restless souls walking in snow. To believe in such stories was not mere superstition. It was a way of explaining the heaviness, of naming the shadows that pressed at the mind. Festivals, too, were medicine for the spirit. Christmas, Candlemas, Carnival, they were not only religious observances, but psychological relief. To sing together, to eat together, to laugh, was to fight back against the silence. To remind each other that life was not only waiting, but living. These moments of joy kept despair from rooting too deeply. Still, winter left its mark. Even survivors carried the memory of long dark seasons, of hunger endured in silence, of arguments sparked by confinement, of loneliness sharpened by endless nights. In some chronicles, we glimpse how whole communities seemed subdued after harsh winters, their spirits broken as much as their numbers reduced. And yet, with the return of spring, energy returned, fields stirred, and life resumed. The heaviness lifted, but it was never forgotten. Perhaps the greatest psychological challenge of medieval winters was uncertainty. Every year, as the cold set in, no one knew who would see spring. Would the larder hold? Would the cough turn deadly? Would famine strike? The long darkness magnified these questions, turning them over in the mind again and again. And in the stillness of the season, there was no distraction, no escape. To endure winter was to endure not only hunger and cold, but the slow erosion of hope. And yet, endure they did. The medieval winter tested both body and mind, but people survived, year after year, generation after generation. Their resilience was not born of comfort, but of necessity. The darkness pressed, confinement weighed, fears gnawed, but life went on. Families told stories, monks prayed, neighbors gathered for song. Against despair, they set small acts of defiance. A fire lit, a loaf baked, a hymn sung in the cold air. Thus the psychological burden of winter was real, but it was also resisted. Medieval people knew the gloom, felt its weight, and yet carried on, not because it was easy, but because survival demanded it. And in their endurance, we glimpse the quiet strength that defined their winters, not triumph. Not joy, but a stubborn persistence that carried them through the long dark until spring returned. When the nights grew long and the winds wailed through forests and across frozen fields, the imagination found shape in the dark. Medieval winters were not just battles against hunger, cold, and illness. They were also seasons of story, when fears and uncertainties took the form of spirits, demons, and wandering souls. In an age without electric lights or modern science, folklore was not merely entertainment. It was explanation, comfort, and warning all at once. The long darkness itself seemed alive. To step outside a cottage on a January night was to enter a void. The sky might glitter with stars, but beneath, the world was shadow, every tree a figure, every noise a whisper of something unseen. It was natural, then, that medieval people filled this emptiness with beings of legend. The night was not silent, but inhabited. Witches flying on bitter winds, fairies luring travelers from paths, demons prowling near barns. In northern Europe, one of the most persistent winter beliefs was the wild hunt. On stormy nights, when winds tore through the trees and snow howled across the fields, people said they heard it, a spectral cavalcade racing across the sky. Ghostly riders, led by a fearsome huntsman, pursued souls or prey unknown. To see the wild hunt was ill-omened death, famine, or war to come. Villagers barred their doors against it, whispering prayers as the storm raged, their imaginations turning thunder and wind into the pounding hooves of phantom steeds. Closer to home, households feared witches and spirits. Winter was a time of vulnerability, when hunger and sickness made communities anxious. Misfortune demanded explanation, and often it was placed at the feet of neighbors suspected of witchcraft. A cow that gave no milk, a child who wasted away, grain that spoiled in the bin, such events could be blamed on curses. In the silence of winter, suspicion thrived, and stories of malice filled the gaps left by understanding. The dead, too, were restless in the medieval winter imagination. Many believed that spirits wandered most freely in the long nights, especially near the turn of the year. In some traditions, the souls of the departed returned to their villages, slipping through cracks in the walls or doors left ajar. Families might leave out offerings, bread, ale, or a seat near the fire to appease them. To deny the dead hospitality was to risk their anger, which could mean illness or bad luck. Animals were also thought to be touched by mystery in winter. On Christmas Eve, it was said, cattle knelt in their stalls at midnight, honoring the birth of Christ. Bees hummed hymns in their hives. Dogs and cats might speak in human voices for an instant, though to overhear them was dangerous, for they spoke often of death to come. These tales, whether believed literally or not, gave the season a sense of enchantment. The natural world seemed closer to the supernatural, the boundary thinner when nights were longest. Rituals arose to guard against these dangers. Fire itself was more than warmth, it was protection. Hearths were kept burning, candles blessed, and torches lit to drive away evil. Wassailing, the custom of singing to orchards, was both celebration and spell, ensuring fertility for the coming year and warding off malign forces. Bells were rung in churches not only to mark holy days, but to banish spirits from villages. Every sound, every flame, every prayer was a bulwark against the unseen. Superstition extended to the handling of food and household tasks. Bread baked on certain days might be blessed against illness. Salt scattered across thresholds kept witches out. Ashes from the Yule log, carefully preserved, were thought to protect homes from lightning or illness if sprinkled around. Winter gave these acts weight, for they were defenses not just against cold, but against misfortune itself. Even stories meant to comfort carried an edge of warning. Parents told children to behave lest winter spirits take them. In Germanic lands, figures like Frau Perchta or the Yule goat were invoked creatures that visited at year's end, rewarding good behavior and punishing the lazy or wicked. These tales kept children obedient during the long, stifling days indoors. While also giving shape to the season's moral lessons, survival required discipline, community, and care. In towns and monasteries, more learned forms of superstition flourished. Astrology guided the understanding of weather and disease. Comets or eclipses were read as signs of famine or plague to come. The alignment of stars in winter skies was thought to predict fortunes of rulers or the fate of harvests. For those who could read, manuscripts recorded these observations, blending scripture, science, and myth into one. The Church, while condemning many folk practices, also absorbed them. Candlemas in February, with its blessing of candles, echoed older rites of light against darkness. Christmas itself, placed in December, coincided with pagan festivals of solstice, when people had long celebrated the turning of the year and the return of light. Rather than erase these traditions, Christianity gave them new meaning, layering sacred significance onto older rhythms of fear and hope. What is striking is how much of this folklore tied directly to the psychological weight of winter. In a time of scarcity, the mind sought explanation. Why did the cow stop giving milk? Why did a child fall ill? Why did storms come without warning? Science offered no answers, but stories did. They made the inexplicable bearable by giving it a face, a name, a narrative. Whether it was a witch's curse, a wandering ghost, or the wild hunt, the unknown became something familiar, something that could at least be spoken of. And in that, folklore was survival of another kind. Just as salted pork carried bodies through hunger, stories carried minds through darkness. To tell tales by the fire was to keep fear at bay, to give community to the lonely hours, to wrap mystery in words instead of silence. These stories soothed as much as they warmed, offering the comfort of tradition, the reassurance that others had endured the same fears before. Thus, winter was not only endured, but narrated. It was haunted by spirits, patrolled by hunters in the sky, filled with voices of animals, guarded by charms and prayers. The folklore of winter was a mirror of its hardships, reflecting cold and hunger into stories of spirits and survival. And though centuries have passed, many of these tales remain, whispered still when nights are long and the wind howls outside. For the medieval peasant, winter was a season of confinement, of huddling close to the fire and waiting for spring. For kings, lords, and their armies, the season posed an even sharper question. Could war be waged when the land was locked in frost? The answer was rarely yes, but when it was, the results were brutal in ways that only winter could make possible. The rhythm of war, like farming, usually followed the seasons. Campaigns were launched in spring, when roads dried and rivers could be crossed. Summer was the season of sieges and open battles. Autumn brought raids designed to seize harvests before they could be stored. Winter, more often than not, ended the fighting. Armies disbanded, soldiers returned home. Lords retreated to castles, and fields lay quiet beneath snow. Yet not all winters were peaceful. Winter campaigns were dreaded for practical reasons. Roads disappeared under snow and ice. Supply lines collapsed when carts could not move and forage vanished. Horses, the engines of medieval armies, weakened without grass or grain, their hooves slipping on frozen ground. Soldiers marched not across firm earth, but through mud, ice, and knee-deep drifts. Even the simple act of setting camp became a hazard. Tents frozen stiff, fires struggling to catch in bitter wind, men shivering through the night. Food was perhaps the greatest obstacle. An army in summer could live off the land, raiding villages for grain, seizing livestock, or buying supplies if they marched through friendly territory. In winter, the land gave nothing. Villages were bare, barns emptied, fields frozen. To feed an army in January required foresight, wagons, and stockpiles luxuries many medieval commanders lacked. Hungry soldiers grew mutinous, and some deserted altogether. More often than not, winter itself defeated armies before battle could. And yet, there were times when kings and commanders pressed forward regardless. Sometimes necessity demanded it. If an enemy sought refuge in a fortress, a siege might drag into winter. If a rebellion threatened, rulers could not wait until spring. At other times, strategy encouraged it. To attack in winter was to strike when least expected, to catch foes unprepared. Consider the Crusades, for instance. Armies marching across unfamiliar landscapes faced winters as dangerous as any enemy. In Anatolia, snow trapped soldiers in passes. In the Levant, cold rain turned camps into swamps of mud, spreading disease and despair. Chroniclers describe men freezing in their armor, starving while besieging cities that held out until spring. The cold did not discriminate between Christian and Muslim, noble or foot soldier. It drained all alike. Closer to home, in northern Europe, campaigns were sometimes timed for winter deliberately. Frozen rivers and marshes, impassable in summer, became solid roads of ice. Armies could march across what was otherwise boggy terrain. Scandinavian warriors, accustomed to snow, used winter as an advantage. Sleds carried supplies where carts could not. Skis and ice allowed rapid movement. For them, winter was not always an enemy. It could be a weapon. But for most medieval armies, the season magnified suffering. Picture a siege in January. Soldiers huddle in makeshift huts, smoke leaking from crude fires. Their clothes stiffen with frost, their boots crack from cold, their hands blister as they hold weapons. Food dwindles. The besieged within the castle fare little better, rationing supplies, eating salted meat until thirst gnaws at them, shivering in chambers that grow no warmer despite thick walls. Winter grinds both sides slowly, its patience greater than any commander's. Disease followed closely. Dysentery, fever, and respiratory infections tore through camps. Water sources froze or became fouled. Waste could not be managed in frozen ground, contaminating snow used for drinking. Armies weakened not from battle, but from the invisible toll of sickness. Chroniclers wrote again and again of more men dying in winter quarters than on the battlefield itself. For ordinary soldiers, winter campaigns were endured with resignation. Cloaks grew stiff, shoes wore through, and blankets were scarce. Many wrapped themselves in straw or tore rags to cover their feet. Death by frostbite was not always recorded, but the image of men found frozen in their tents appears in chronicles. It was war without glory, a battle not against men, but against the season itself. Even the mighty could not escape. Kings and nobles shivered alongside their men, their feasts no match for the draughts that crept into their tents or the smoke that stung their eyes. Commanders planned great strategies, but winter often reduced them to mere survival. Armies intended for conquest found themselves immobilized, waiting helplessly for thaw. And yet, the memory of those rare successful winter campaigns echoed strongly. A bold raid in December might secure supplies before an enemy expected it. A march across frozen rivers could bypass defenses. Victories won in the snow carried symbolic weight, a reminder that not even nature could stop a determined ruler. Chroniclers praised such daring, but they also noted the cost soldiers who never returned, starved or frozen, buried not in battlefields, but in drifts of snow. Thus, the medieval winter shaped war as much as it shaped farming, food, or health. It dictated the rhythm of campaigns, forced armies into uneasy truces, and punished those reckless enough to ignore its power. More than once, the season itself decided the fate of kingdoms. A poorly supplied army was destroyed not by swords, but by frost. A fortress survived not by walls alone, but by the endurance of its defenders through cold months. To march in winter was to march against the earth itself. And in the end, the earth usually won. If the medieval winter pressed harshly on villages and armies, it also pressed on monasteries. These communities of monks and nuns were bound not by the plow or the sword, but by rhythm, prayer, and service. And yet, they were not immune to cold, hunger, or illness. Their cloisters, chapels, and scriptoria were no warmer than the cottages outside their walls. Still, monasteries stood as places of endurance and resilience, where survival was shaped by discipline, devotion, and the practical wisdom of centuries. The monastic day did not change with the season. Bells rang in darkness, calling monks to prayers long before dawn. They rose from cold pallets, pulled on habits stiff with frost, and walked across stone floors that bit into their bare feet. Their breath curled into the air as they chanted the night office, their voices rising in harmony even as their bodies shivered. To pray in a winter chapel was to feel both the chill of stone and the warmth of shared devotion. The cloister, that central square of monastic life, lay open to the elements. In summer, its gardens bloomed with herbs and flowers. In winter, frost crusted the flagstones, snow drifted against colonnades, and monks moved quickly through the biting air. Yet the routine continued. Study, copying manuscripts, tending the sick, preparing meals, all were done with the same quiet persistence. Winter was simply another season of discipline. Practical survival, however, required more than prayer. Monasteries often had larger and more reliable stores than villages. Their lands were extensive, their harvests managed carefully, and their cellars better stocked. Grain, salted fish, dried beans, and wine were stored in stone vaults, safe from rodents and damp. Livestock provided milk, cheese, and meat. Orchards and gardens, planted in warmer months, supplied fruit and herbs that could be preserved. While peasants rationed scraps, monasteries, at least in better years, had enough to carry them through. This abundance came with responsibility. In famine years, villagers often turned to monasteries for aid. Hungry families lined the gates, begging for bread or broth. Some monasteries responded generously, feeding the poor from their kitchens, distributing alms, or opening their infirmaries to the sick. Others guarded their stores more jealously, reserving food for their own community. Chroniclers sometimes praised monasteries for their charity, but just as often condemned them for hoarding. Still, monasteries were woven into the web of survival, their resources a crucial lifeline in times of want. Inside, the monastic rhythm shaped endurance. Meals were plain bread, beans, cheese, sometimes fish, but they were regular. Even in the depths of winter, monks ate at set times, their portions meager but steady. Fasting seasons continued, even when hunger was already real. Lent, arriving in late winter, demanded abstinence from meat, dairy, and fat at precisely the moment when food was scarcest. For monks, this was not simply survival, but spiritual discipline. To endure hunger was to grow closer to God. The cold, however, was not easily sanctified. The scriptorium, where monks copied texts, was infamous in winter. Ink froze in wells. Fingers numbed as they held quills. Manuscripts were smudged by trembling hands. Marginal notes from monks complained quietly. "The cold is great. My fingers are stiff. How hard it is to write in winter." These small laments, tucked beside holy texts, remind us that devotion did not banish discomfort. Monks found small ways to adapt. Woolen habits were layered. Hoods were drawn tight. Stone floors were strewn with straw for insulation. Fires, though limited, were permitted in kitchens and infirmaries, and sometimes in the scriptorium itself. Still, austerity remained. To suffer cold patiently was a virtue, a test of humility and endurance. Stories circulated of saints who embraced the chill, who slept without blankets, who accepted frost as a gift of discipline. For most monks, though, it was simply another burden to endure. Winter also reshaped monastic labor. Fields were dormant, so attention turned inward. Beeswax candles were poured, herbs dried and stored, accounts tallied. Monks brewed ale, fermented wine, and prepared medicines. Their knowledge of herbs sage, thyme, garlic, honey was put to use in treating winter illnesses. Monastic infirmaries became refuges for the sick, not only monks, but sometimes villagers seeking help. Though limited by the medicine of their age, the care was steady. Warm broths, prayers, bed rest, and what herbs could be offered. For nuns, the rhythm was similar. Convents kept the same hours of prayer, and endured the same cold. They too produced food, spun wool, and offered charity when possible. Nuns were sometimes praised for their dedication to caring for the sick in winter, their infirmaries sheltering the weak when villages could not. In both monasteries and convents, winter survival was woven into devotion, body and soul, enduring together. The wider cultural role of monasteries in winter cannot be overstated. They were centers of stability in an unstable season. Their bells marked time when daylight failed. Their rituals reminded communities that the year had rhythm, that even in darkness, sacred days and feasts gave structure. Their alms provided survival for the poorest. Their knowledge of agriculture and preservation influenced the practices of villages around them. In famine, plague, or war, monasteries often became the anchor of endurance. Yet monasteries also mirrored the season's contradictions. They were places of discipline, where cold and hunger were borne as penance. They were also places of relative abundance, where food was more secure than in the cottages outside. They offered charity, but also sometimes hoarded. They sanctified suffering, but also sought comfort where possible. They were human institutions, enduring the same winter as all, but with resources and rituals that gave them an edge. To imagine a medieval monastery in January is to picture both hardship and resilience. The cloister is silent, frosted with snow. Monks walk with hoods drawn low, chanting softly as their breath curls white. In the refectory, bowls of pottage steam faintly. In the scriptorium, a monk bends over parchment, muttering about his frozen fingers. At the gate, villagers wait, hungry, hoping for alms. And above it all, the bells toll, marking hours, reminding all within earshot that winter is not endless, that time moves forward, that spring will come. Thus, monasteries stood as small fortresses of endurance in a brutal season. They did not escape the cold, nor the hunger, nor the illness. But through discipline, devotion, and resources, they bore it steadily, and in doing so, they offered a measure of survival, not only for themselves, but for the world around them. If winter pressed heavily on the body, the church pressed heavily on the soul. For medieval people, the cold months were not only endured as a physical trial, but also embraced sometimes unwillingly, sometimes deliberately, as a spiritual discipline. The long hunger of January, the slow silence of February, the dark stillness that wrapped the land, all were seen through the lens of religion. To suffer in winter was not merely to survive. It was to be tested, to be purified, even to be drawn closer to God. The Christian calendar ensured that fasting coincided with some of the hardest months of the year. Advent, the season before Christmas, was originally observed with fasting, though in practice it varied from place to place. More rigid was Lent, beginning in February or March, when winter's food stores were already strained. At precisely the moment when cupboards were thinnest, the church demanded abstinence from meat, dairy, and eggs. For the poor, who had little to abstain from anyway, Lent meant eating even less than usual, stretching the last scraps of grain and beans. For the wealthy, it meant replacing meat with fish, often salted or dried, itself a weary diet after months of the same. The logic was not arbitrary. Hunger was a form of penance. To deny the body was to discipline the soul. Just as Christ had fasted in the desert, so too must Christians fast in winter. To endure cold without complaint, to suffer hunger with humility, was to imitate his sacrifice. The season itself, harsh and unforgiving, became a kind of natural monastery, teaching patience, endurance, and submission to divine will. For peasants, fasting often blurred with necessity. If the larder was already bare, abstinence was not a choice, but a fact. Yet the church gave meaning to this inevitability. To go hungry was to share in sacred suffering. Even the poorest could find spiritual dignity in their empty bowls. Priests reminded villagers that every skipped meal, every gnawing hunger, was an offering, a prayer made through the body. For monks, fasting was more deliberate. Their rules demanded abstinence. Their tables served little more than bread, beans, and water during penitential seasons. Some went further, embracing the cold and hunger as holy trials. Hagiographies, the lives of saints, celebrated figures who endured winters without fire, who ate only roots, who wore hair shirts against bare skin to magnify discomfort. Such extremes were rare, but the ideal they embodied was admired: holiness through hardship. Penance, too, found its sharpest edge in winter. Pilgrims trudging barefoot through snow, sinners kneeling in frost as public penance, hermits retreating into icy wilderness. These acts were recorded not as cruelty, but as devotion. The season itself offered tools of discipline: cold, darkness, hunger. To embrace them willingly was to show strength of faith. To endure them patiently, even unwillingly, was still to participate in divine testing. At the communal level, fasting seasons unified. Whole villages adjusted their diets together, abstaining from meat, sharing simpler meals, attending longer services. The monotony of winter pottage gained new meaning when framed as penance. Families who had little to eat could still frame their suffering as obedience, part of a rhythm larger than themselves. Hunger became less humiliation, more sanctification. Symbolism wrapped itself around every hardship. The darkness of long nights recalled the darkness before Christ's coming, or the darkness of sin. The cold was likened to the chill of the soul without grace. Hunger mirrored spiritual emptiness. And each was met with hope. Dawn would come, spring would arrive, Easter would follow Lent. The rhythms of nature and the rhythms of liturgy intertwined, each echoing the other. Festivals punctuated these penitential seasons, not as contradictions, but as balance. Christmas, with its feasting, came only after Advent's preparation. Carnival, with its indulgence, came only before Lent's abstinence. The oscillation between feast and fast gave structure to the year, keeping joy meaningful by placing it against hunger, warmth treasured only after cold. Of course, not all welcomed these disciplines. Chronicles record complaints peasants who broke fast out of desperation, nobles who indulged despite rules, monks who grumbled in the margins of manuscripts about their frozen fingers and empty bellies. Yet even disobedience reinforced the system, for it proved how heavy the discipline was, how much effort was required to bear it. To fail was human, to try was divine. The physical realities of winter thus became woven into spiritual life. A cough was a trial, a failed harvest a test, a hungry stomach a form of prayer. For medieval Christians, suffering was not meaningless. It was part of the story of salvation, a small echo of Christ's own passion. In this way, winter, with all its brutality, was sanctified. But beneath theology, there was also psychology. To see hunger as penance was to endure it more easily. To see cold as discipline was to bear it with more dignity. Religion did not remove suffering, but it softened its sting, gave it purpose, placed it within a cosmic narrative of trial and redemption. Without that framework, the season might have seemed unbearable. With it, it became survivable. Thus, winter fasting and penance were not only rules imposed from above. They were coping mechanisms, spiritual tools that turned scarcity into meaning. To live through a medieval winter was to suffer. To frame that suffering as holy was to make endurance itself into an act of faith. And so, when the bells rang in dark February mornings, calling villagers to church and monks to prayer, the cold and hunger were not only burdens, they were reminders. That life was fragile, that faith was endurance, and that winter, like sin, would pass into light and warmth again. In every medieval winter, the balance of power tilted toward those who had stores of grain. Lords, abbots, and wealthy landlords, whose granaries were larger and whose herds more numerous, became the quiet arbiters of survival for the peasants beneath them. Scarcity magnified hierarchy. The hunger of the poor and the abundance of the rich created a stark contrast that winter sharpened into focus. A peasant household, as we have seen, measured the season by dwindling stores, the root cellar thinning, the salted pork shrinking, the grain sack emptied scoop by scoop. By February, many families found themselves looking outward. They had eaten the pig, stretched the pottage, earned the last kindling. What remained was not enough. And so they looked up the chain to the landlord, the monastery, the manor court for relief or for mercy. For the lord of the manor, winter was a test of authority. Rent and dues were still owed, even when hunger was thick. Peasants who fell behind risked fines, punishments, or loss of land. Some lords demanded grain or livestock as rent precisely when peasants could least spare it. The irony was harsh. In the very season when bellies were empty, obligations were most pressing. The landlord's power lay not only in his barns, but in his right to demand. Yet the same scarcity that gave lords leverage also demanded a degree of charity, or at least calculation. A lord who bled his tenants dry risked revolt, or at least the collapse of his own estate when too many peasants starved. The survival of the workforce was the survival of the manor itself. And so, some lords distributed alms in lean years, not out of compassion alone, but out of prudence. Bread handed out at the manor gate, grain sold at reduced prices, or feasts at Christmastide all, reinforced loyalty, softened resentment, and presented the lord as both protector and provider. Monasteries, too, wielded power in scarcity. Their granaries were often better stocked, their cellars deeper, their lands richer. Villagers lined up outside cloister gates, hoping for a ladle of broth or a hunk of bread. To give was charity, but it was also influence. A monastery known for generosity earned reverence. One known for hoarding bred resentment. The line between spiritual authority and material necessity blurred in winter. To save bodies was to win souls. Peasants, meanwhile, were trapped in dependency. In famine years, they borrowed grain from their lord, to be repaid with interest at harvest. They mortgaged the coming year's labor for survival today. They surrendered autonomy for a loaf of bread. Debt mounted silently through winters, binding them tighter to the estate. Hunger enforced hierarchy more effectively than law. At times, scarcity fueled unrest. Chronicles record villages rioting at manor storehouses, storming grain reserves, or demanding lower rents when hunger became unbearable. These were dangerous moments, for winter desperation made peasants bold. Yet the weight of power usually prevailed. Lords commanded armed retainers. Monasteries invoked the church's authority. Revolt was punished harshly, and fear of reprisal often kept hunger in check. The symbolism of provision also mattered. A Christmas feast given by a lord, with tables of meat and ale, was more than celebration. It was a reminder of hierarchy. The Lord fed his people, and in return they owed him loyalty. Even in famine, when the poor starved, the sight of a lord's generosity, however selective, reinforced the idea that survival was tied to his will. Winter scarcity magnified this relationship. To live or die was often a matter of whether the landlord chose to open his stores, but lords themselves were not immune. A careless steward, a series of bad harvests, or war in the region could empty even a noble's granaries. Castles might be besieged by hunger just as villages were. Wealth softened the blow, but it did not erase it. Nobles who mismanaged their estates risked losing tenants, losing land, even losing face among their peers. In this way, scarcity was both a tool of power and a mirror of responsibility. Still, the imbalance remained stark. For the peasant, hunger was a season of waiting, of hoping the Lord would relent, the monastery would give, the spring would come. For the landlord, it was a season of consolidation, of strengthening bonds of dependency, of turning necessity into authority. Hunger itself became a form of currency, traded for loyalty, labor, or obedience. It is sobering to imagine how absolute this dependence felt. A peasant with no food in February, children crying at night, stomachs hollow, would walk to the manor gate with cap in hand. Whatever he received, bread, grain, or nothing determined survival. The Lord might grant mercy, might demand repayment, or might turn him away. In that moment, the power of hierarchy was not theoretical. It was as real as hunger itself. Thus, winter scarcity was not only a natural trial, but a social one. It magnified the inequalities already embedded in medieval life. Lords feasted while peasants rationed. Monasteries distributed alms while villagers begged. Power was measured not in swords or walls, but in bushels of grain. And as the season dragged on, that power grew sharper, binding communities tighter in webs of dependence. Spring would come, fields would thaw, and labor would resume. But winter left its mark. Debts carried forward, obligations deepened, resentments simmered. The cycle repeated year after year, each winter reminding peasants of their reliance, and each winter reminding lords of their authority. In this way, winter was not just a season of survival, it was a season of power. The cold, the hunger, the silence all served to reinforce the structures of medieval life, ensuring that hierarchy endured as surely as the frost. When we think of medieval technology, we might imagine castles, cathedrals, or siege engines. But in truth, some of the most significant innovations were born not from war or grandeur, but from necessity, especially the necessity of surviving winter. Cold, scarcity, and darkness acted as relentless teachers, forcing communities to adapt, to invent, and to refine the tools that kept them alive through the harshest months of the year. The most fundamental of these technologies was the fire itself. To us, it may not seem like technology at all, but for medieval people, the management of fire was both science and art. Hearths were central to survival, and their design evolved over centuries. Early medieval homes often had open fire pits in the middle of a room, the smoke drifting upward and out through a hole in the roof. This was inefficient; most heat escaped, and the smoke filled lungs as much as it warmed bodies. Over time, chimneys appeared, first in monasteries and noble houses, later spreading to towns. A chimney did not merely carry away smoke. It allowed fires to burn hotter and longer, making rooms marginally warmer and cooking more reliable. In a sense, the chimney was a quiet revolution against winter, one brick at a time. Clothing, too, was shaped by the cold. The widespread use of layered wool was itself a kind of technological adaptation. Spinning wheels, though not common in Europe until later in the Middle Ages, gradually increased the efficiency of turning fleece into yarn. Before their arrival, the spindle and distaff ruled, producing thread slowly but steadily. Winter's demand for warm clothing gave urgency to these crafts. Weaving looms, though ancient, became central in villages, with winter providing the long hours needed to produce cloth. The cold forced innovation, not only in making clothing, but also in dyeing and treating fabric, making it more durable and insulating. Food preservation may have been the most directly winter-shaped technology. Without it, survival through long months would have been impossible. Salting was both chemistry and logistics. Salt itself had to be mined, transported, and purchased, often at great expense. The demand for preserved meat spurred entire industries of salt production and trade, from the salt pans of the Mediterranean to the mines of Central Europe. Smokehouses, too, became common in villages, their dark interiors lined with hams and fish, suspended in aromatic haze. Cellars dug deep into the ground represented another technological adaptation, exploiting the earth, coolness to keep root vegetables edible through winter. Even architecture bore the imprint of winter. Thicker walls, smaller windows, and sloped thatch roofs were practical responses to snow, wind, and rain. Floors strewn with rushes provided crude insulation against cold earth. Castles and monasteries incorporated tapestries, not merely as decoration, but as a technological answer to drafts, transforming fabric into insulation. Bed curtains created microclimates around sleepers. A simple but effective trick to trap body heat in otherwise frigid chambers. In towns, houses huddled together, their shared walls conserving warmth, a kind of communal insulation born from necessity. Agriculture, though paused in winter, carried winter's lessons forward into innovation. Heavy plows, drawn by oxen, were not designed for winter use, but for soils compacted by years of freezing and thawing. Crop rotation, adopted widely in the later Middle Ages, was a strategy to prevent famine, ensuring that when winter came, stores would last longer. The rhythm of hunger pushed farmers to diversify crops, cultivating beans and peas not just for summer meals, but for the protein they provided during the long months when meat was scarce. Even water management reflected winter's influence. Wells had to be designed to avoid freezing, with covers and shelters built to protect access. In colder regions, systems of storing ice and snow deliberately, turning them into reservoirs for summer developed, particularly in monasteries and noble estates. Winter taught not only how to endure scarcity, but how to anticipate abundance, how to carry resources forward through seasons. Lighting, too, was shaped by the darkness of winter. Rushlights were crude but essential, their production requiring careful preparation of fat and reeds. The expensive beeswax candles spurred monasteries and churches to develop more efficient beekeeping practices, managing hives with care to produce wax as well as honey. Light was not mere convenience. It was survival, for without it, the long nights were endless. In this sense, every flicker of flame was technological resistance against winter's claim on time itself. Transport also adapted. While snow and ice blocked roads, they also created new pathways. In Scandinavia and parts of Eastern Europe, sledges and skis turned frozen landscapes into highways. Rivers that were dangerous in flood became solid tracks of ice. Armies and traders alike learned to use frozen ground to their advantage, carrying goods or weapons where no cart could roll in summer mud. Winter thus reshaped not only how people endured stillness, but how they moved across it. In a broader sense, winter itself was a laboratory of patience. It demanded long hours indoors, which encouraged small crafts to develop into technologies. Spinning, weaving, wood carving, leatherwork all were refined in the months when fields lay dormant. The tools of survival in summer were built and repaired in winter. A plow sharpened by the firelight of January was ready for the thaw of March. A cloak stitched in February kept its wearer alive in November. Winter technology was not always dramatic, but it was steady, cumulative, born of repetition. The church framed much of this in spiritual language, but beneath devotion lay practicality. A fasting monk needed preserved fish, so monasteries perfected preservation. A cold scriptorium needed better ink, so recipes for frost-resistant mixtures circulated. Every prayer whispered in winter was accompanied, quietly, by a practical adjustment to survive the season. So when we think of medieval technology, we must see winter's hand upon it. Chimneys, smokehouses, root cellars, spinning wheels, sledges, even tapestries, all were shaped, sharpened, or spread by the demand to endure cold months. The great cathedrals of stone may dazzle us today, but the quiet genius of winter's technologies kept people alive, generation after generation. In the end, winter was not only a trial, but a teacher. It taught thrift, patience, and ingenuity. It demanded invention, not in bursts of glory, but in small, practical steps, a warmer cloak, a sturdier roof, a brighter candle. These were not grand machines of war or glory, but humble tools of survival. And in them, we see how deeply the medieval winter shaped not just suffering, but human resilience itself. Though we often speak of the medieval winter as a single experience, in truth, it varied greatly across Europe. The season in Norway was not the season in Naples. The hardships of a peasant in Denmark were different from those of a shepherd in Sicily. Yet across this wide continent, one truth held: winter tested survival everywhere, only in different ways. By comparing the North and South, we see how climate, culture, and resources shaped different responses to the same season of scarcity. In the North, the British Isles, Scandinavia, the Low Countries, Germany, and much of Eastern Europe, winter was long and severe. Snow blanketed fields for months. Rivers froze, and daylight shrank to a narrow band between long nights. Crops grew only in the warmer months. And so the rhythm of survival demanded careful storage. Grain, salted meat, smoked fish, and root vegetables were the pillars of diet. Failure to store enough was disaster. Clothing reflected this need. Northern Europe was wrapped in wool and fur, layered thick against the cold. Cloaks, mittens, hoods, and bed curtains were not luxuries, but necessities. Houses were built stout, with steeply pitched roofs to shed snow, and walls thick enough, though never thick enough, to resist the wind. Even castles bore winter's weight, their stones crusted with frost, their halls filled with smoke from fires that never seemed to warm more than a few feet. The psychological toll in the North was also sharper. Darkness stretched endlessly, with the sun low in the sky. Winter festivals, such as Yule in Scandinavian lands, or Christmas and Candlemas elsewhere, were not simply religious but existential. They broke despair, marked the turning of the year, reassured communities that spring would indeed return. Stories of the wild hunt, of trolls or witches in the dark, reflected the unease bred by long nights and empty landscapes. In contrast, the South Italy, Spain, Portugal, southern France, and the Mediterranean coasts knew a different kind of winter. Snow was rare in many regions, though mountain villages saw it. Days were shorter, but not overwhelmingly so, and the sun still held warmth. Olive trees, vines, and citrus grew in these climates, and while harvests ended in autumn, some greenery persisted even in the coldest months. Winters were milder, but this did not mean they were easy. In southern Europe, the challenge was less freezing cold than scarcity of water or sudden storms. Crops could still fail, and when they did, famine struck just as hard as in the north. But diets differed. Olive oil replaced lard or butter, dried figs and raisins supplemented root vegetables, and preserved fish like sardines or anchovies provided protein. Where northern tables leaned heavily on salted pork, southern tables leaned more on legumes and bread baked from wheat rather than rye or barley. Clothing in the south reflected milder climates, lighter wool, looser garments, fewer layers. Fur was still valued, especially by the wealthy, but it was less necessity than status symbol. Houses, too, differed. Whitewashed walls reflected sun even in winter, and flat or tiled roofs suited regions with less snow. Windows were larger, often with shutters rather than glass, though they still let in drafts. For a villager in Andalusia or Sicily, winter meant dampness and chill more than deep frost. Religion bound north and south alike, but the meaning of festivals carried subtle differences. In northern Europe, the Christmas feast broke long stretches of hunger and darkness, filling halls with warmth against the deep freeze outside. In the south, Christmas was no less celebrated, but the contrast between feast and environment was softer. The symbolism of light and darkness resonated more sharply in Norway than in Naples. Carnival before Lent, however, was exuberant everywhere, with southern towns staging parades and masquerades under milder skies, while northern villages danced and sang despite the snow. Yet despite these differences, famine and disease did not spare the South. Malnutrition in Italy or Spain could be just as deadly as in Germany or England. The plague swept equally through Mediterranean ports and northern villages, ignoring climate. The key difference was the form of hardship. In the north, it was the endless dark, the freezing cold, the need for heavy stores of food. In the south, it was the damp chill, the poor harvests caused by storms or drought, the reliance on trade routes that could be disrupted by war, or piracy. Trade itself marked another contrast. In southern Europe, proximity to the Mediterranean allowed more imports during lean times. Grain might be brought by ship from North Africa or Sicily to Italy. Salted fish and olive oil moved between coasts. This web of trade softened famine's edge, though only for those who could afford it. In the north, inland villages were more isolated. When the roads were frozen or snowbound, supplies simply could not come. Scarcity that was absolute, softened only by communal sharing or the landlord's mercy. Psychologically, southern winters may have been less crushing, but they still shaped culture. Folklore there often spoke less of darkness and more of storms or restless spirits that wandered in damp nights. Saints were invoked for rain or sunshine, for the safety of harvests yet to come. The sense of winter as a test of patience and endurance was universal, but the imagery differed with climate. And yet, whether in north or south, the underlying truth was the same. Winter reminded people of fragility. It exposed dependence on the land, on stored food, on neighbors, on the mercy of lords or God. It underscored the thin line between survival and death. A poor harvest in Tuscany might not bring snow, but it brought hunger. A long frost in England might not permit olives, but it demanded salted pork. The specifics shifted, but the core struggle endured everywhere. What unites these differences is resilience. Northern peasants spun wool and layered clothing until warmth was trapped. Southern peasants dried figs and pressed olives, stretching summer into winter. Both faced hunger, both faced illness, both faced the psychological weight of waiting. And in both regions, festivals, rituals, and stories gave meaning to endurance. So while we speak of the medieval winter, it is more accurate to say there were many winters, each shaped by geography, but all bound by the same human thread. From frostbitten fields in Norway to damp stone houses in Naples, people endured. The details differed, but the rhythm of scarcity, suffering, and persistence was universal. When you settle in today for a winter evening, perhaps you do not think too much about the cold. You close a window or adjust a thermostat. Maybe you pull a blanket around your shoulders, and the hum of machinery somewhere beyond the walls takes care of the rest. Your refrigerator hums softly, preserving food without smoke or salt. Electric lights glow, pushing back the long night with quiet constancy. If you are thirsty, you turn a tap and clean water flows. These are so ordinary now that they barely deserve notice. But for the medieval person, every one of these was unimaginable luxury. Consider warmth. In the Middle Ages, a fire was not convenience, but survival. Yet fires were fickle. They smoked, filling homes with soot and irritating eyes. They demanded fuel, and gathering wood in winter was exhausting, sometimes even forbidden by law if forests belonged to a lord. A single hearth could not truly warm a stone hall, only the few who clustered near. At night, rooms grew cold again, no matter how much wood had been burned. Compare this to the invisible efficiency of central heating, where entire homes stay warm without thought. Food, too, tells the story of change. A medieval family faced winter with dread if stores were low. Every apple shriveled in the cellar was counted, every strip of bacon carefully rationed. Bread grew stale, flour might harbor weevils, salted meat grew tougher by the week. Fresh greens were almost unheard of until spring. In contrast, your winter table may hold oranges from Spain, bananas from Ecuador, strawberries even in January, thanks to trade and refrigeration. To eat fresh fruit in midwinter would have seemed miraculous to a medieval peasant. Lighting is another quiet miracle. Imagine a medieval evening where candles or oil lamps gave faint illumination. Each was precious, each consumed quickly. A household might conserve by living in semi-darkness, relying on firelight. A single candle could mean the difference between reading after sunset or going early to bed. And yet now, the flip of a switch floods a room with brightness, enough to banish shadows entirely. The rhythm of night and day still exists, but modern light has softened its power. Water deserves its own reflection. In winter, medieval families often relied on frozen wells, icy rivers, or stored rainwater. Carrying water in cold weather was misery. Ice formed on buckets, and paths grew treacherous. Hygiene suffered because washing oneself or clothing meant exposure to biting cold. But now, hot water gushes from taps, steaming away chill, turning winter bathing into comfort rather than ordeal. It is difficult to overstate what transformation this represents. Water that is not only safe, but warm, plentiful, and effortless. The rhythm of illness, too, has changed. In medieval winters, colds and fevers struck hard. Pneumonia or influenza could kill with little recourse. Houses were damp, smoky, and poorly ventilated, ideal breeding grounds for sickness. Medicine was limited, often more superstition than science. Today, while illness still comes, antibiotics, vaccines, and heated homes make survival far more likely. A child's winter cough in the past might have ended a life. Now, it usually means a few days of rest. Clothing illustrates the difference in another quiet way. In medieval Europe, wool was the armor of winter. Layer upon layer insulated body heat. Wealthier people wore fur, while peasants layered coarse cloth. Washing was rare, and garments grew heavy with dirt. Clothes were patched and mended until unwearable. Today, clothing is not only warmer, but lighter, cleaner, and easier to replace. Insulation, synthetic fibers, and even electric blankets create warmth without the burden of weight. Even the experience of travel has been transformed. In the Middle Ages, winter travel was often impossible. Snow blocked roads, rivers froze, mud swallowed carts. To journey in January was dangerous unless necessary. Many villages were cut off for months. In contrast, modern vehicles, plows, and salted roads keep movement possible. Airplanes fly above storms, trains run through snow, and ships move across seas regardless of season. A person today may scarcely notice the season at all when traveling from one city to another. But perhaps the most profound change is psychological. Medieval winters demanded vigilance and patience. Every day of snow reminded people of hunger waiting in cellars, of sickness hiding in smoke-filled rooms, of darkness stretching without end. Festivals were essential not only for faith, but for sanity, giving light to break long months of gloom. Today, winter is softened into something many even enjoy. Hot chocolate, soft lights, holidays, music, indoor comfort. These have turned what was once dread into nostalgia. And yet, echoes remain. You might still feel a flicker of ancient unease when nights lengthen. The quiet anxiety that comes with short days may be little more than biology remembering centuries of struggle. The instinct to gather with others in winter, to feast at Christmas or New Year, to fill homes with light and warmth, comes directly from those ancestors who needed such rituals to survive. Though technology has softened the edges, the cultural memory remains. It is worth pausing, then, to notice the ease that surrounds you. A radiator that clicks softly to life. A refrigerator full of food. A window that keeps out the draft. These are answers to problems that once consumed lives. Entire communities once revolved around preparing for and enduring winter, and failure to prepare meant tragedy. Today, the struggle is hidden, handled by machines, systems, and global trade. But the difference is not just comfort. It is survival itself. Still, winter retains symbolic weight. It continues to mark endings and beginnings, to carry rituals of light and gathering. But now, you can experience it gently, as beauty rather than fear. Snow is no longer hunger's herald, but something to watch through a pane of glass while wrapped in warmth. Long nights are not despair, but opportunity for reading, reflection, or rest. Winter remains, but the brutality of it has largely been tamed. And yet, imagining those older winters deepens our appreciation. To picture a medieval family huddled around a smoky fire, rationing salted meat, dreading famine, is to understand how fragile life once was. To contrast it with the modern scene of abundance and light is to recognize not only what we have gained, but what was endured. Winter has not changed. It is we who have. When you think of winter now, you may picture snow falling in silence, rooftops softened under white, or the quiet glow of holiday lights strung along streets. Winter has become, for many, a season of beauty. It is a time for pause, for gathering, for warmth found in comfort rather than fear. But in the medieval mind, winter was never only about beauty. It was about survival. And yet, because of that, it grew rich in meaning spiritual, cultural, and symbolic. Those meanings have not entirely disappeared. They drift into our present like snowflakes carried by memory. For medieval people, winter symbolized endings. The death of crops, the retreat of the sun, the silence of fields. Trees shed their leaves, animals vanished into hibernation, and daylight itself seemed to abandon the world. Each shortening day pressed upon the mind with a reminder that life was fragile, that time itself could feel like it was closing in. But endings, in their eyes, were also part of cycles. Winter was death, but it was also the necessary step before renewal. Without its cold pause, spring could not return. This gave winter a place in faith and folklore. Christianity, which saturated medieval Europe, filled the season with meaning. Advent, Christmas, Epiphany, each festival, placed light in the heart of darkness. Candles flickered not only for practical light, but for symbolic light, reassurance against despair. Midwinter became a time of ritual feasting, not despite scarcity, but because of it. To eat together, to sing together, to share firelight was to push back against the void, to remind one another that the sun would indeed return. Older traditions lingered too, woven beneath the Christian fabric. The solstice carried its weight, the longest night of the year, when the sun seemed weakest. Many cultures celebrated the rebirth of light, marking it with bonfires, evergreen boughs, or symbols of fertility and renewal. Even when cloaked in new names, these older echoes remained, because the experience of winter was so deeply felt that it demanded ritual expression. People needed to mark the turn of the seasons, to acknowledge the darkness, and to welcome the light. Beyond faith, winter shaped imagination. Stories told in winter were often about endurance, about patience, about creatures lurking in the shadows of snow. Wolves haunted tailies, not only because they prowled at the edges of villages, but because they symbolized hunger itself. Fairy tales carried warnings wrapped in frost. Legends of travelers lost in storms, of spirits moving through the night, of frozen kingdoms where life seemed suspended. All of these came from real experience of the season. To fear winter was natural, and so it became a canvas for storytelling. It also shaped language. Words like Yule, frost, long night, deep cold carried more than descriptive weight. They became shorthand for hardship. A harsh ruler might be compared to winter itself, unyielding, bitter, life-draining. But also, winter could symbolize purity, clarity, even renewal. Snow fell equally upon rich and poor, reminding all of the leveling force of nature. The season was not only cruel, but cleansing. In literature and song, winter carried both menace and quiet grace. In daily life, the symbolism was lived, not just imagined. Each family's rituals, the lighting of fires, the baking of seasonal bread, the gathering for midwinter feasts were symbolic acts. They were statements of defiance against hunger, and at the same time, acknowledgments of it. To sing carols in the cold was to tell the season, "You will not silence us." To drink spiced ale was to say, "We still taste sweetness, even now." These little gestures were survival made into culture. Fast forward to the present, and you can still see traces of this. Why do we hang lights at Christmas, or cover trees in ornaments, or gather around tables heavy with food? The abundance is less necessity now and more tradition, but the origin lies in survival. Medieval winters trained communities to lean on ritual, and those rituals linger even when the threat has gone. You may not worry about starvation, but still you crave light in December. Still you gather with others. Still you create warmth where cold presses in. In literature and poetry, winter continues to represent something beyond itself. Writers call upon it to signal endings, to mark hardship, to create atmospheres of reflection. Painters fill canvases with bare trees and frozen rivers to evoke quiet, stillness, or loneliness. Musicians compose pieces that echo the slow hush of falling snow or the sharp bite of icy winds. The season continues to inspire because its symbolism was carved deeply by centuries of lived struggle. Yet, despite all the symbolism of hardship, winter also stands for endurance. Think of the phrase, the dead of winter. It implies a low point, a nadir, but always winter passes. Medieval people clung to that truth, and it still holds. The darkest night is always followed by lengthening days. Snow eventually melts. The cycle continues. Winter, then, is not merely about suffering. It is about the certainty of change. Today, when you curl under a blanket, you may feel winter only as a quiet backdrop. You may even find peace in it. But the medieval experience lingers in your traditions, in your language, and in your instincts. The need for light, for warmth, for gathering, it all comes from that long history of survival. Winter has shaped culture as much as it shaped the landscape. Its brutality created rituals of resilience, and those rituals continue, softened now into comfort. And perhaps this is why winter remains compelling. Even if you no longer fear famine or illness in quite the same way, you feel its depth. It still carries the whisper of ages when survival was not guaranteed. The hush of falling snow still suggests mystery. The cold still presses against windows with a reminder that nature is larger than human effort. Winter is brutal, yes, but in that brutality, it has also been deeply formative. So when you next sip a hot drink while frost blooms across the glass, you are part of that long story. You are living the softened version of what once was a desperate season. Winter has become, in a sense, tamed. But its symbolism, the darkness, the endurance, the return of light, remains as old as humanity itself.